All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon when you are watching this screencast. So today we're going to talk about Napoleon. We're going to focus in on his rise to power. We're not going to talk at all about his fall and how quickly he fell off. We'll hit on that at a different time, but we're going to spend the first part of this just talking about how he rose to power. Okay, so Napoleon had the coup. He overtook the government, and so he is the one in charge of all of France. So, what are some of the domestic policies that he puts in place? So, when I say domestic policies, I'm talking about policies that are at home. And honestly, the best way that I can remember the difference between domestic and foreign, I think of, when somebody gets in trouble at home with the law, or domestic violence, right? That's violence is taking place at home. So domestic policies are policies that a country is putting in place within their own country. And a foreign policy would be policies they're putting in place that deal with other countries. So what is Napoleon doing in France? So one of the biggest things is Napoleon is going to, come out and say, "Hey, I have preserved all of those gains of the revolution. Everything that was put in place in the revolution, we're going to live up to that, and we're going to do that." That whole idea of the Republican liberty, that idea is really kind of destroyed though when Napoleon takes over. Just because of the way that he takes over. But let's focus in on kind of what are some of the ideas that are maintained from the French Revolution throughout Napoleon's era. So when it comes to the church, Napoleon wants this peace with the church. Remember, we talked about how everything was kind of de-Christianized and they did away with calendars. They changed the calendars. They changed the street names, everything like that. Well, Napoleon wants this peace between the Catholic Church and France. So he makes this agreement with the Pope. And he decides that he's going to recognize, Catholicism as the religion of the French people. So when he says we're going to recognize, that being Catholic is the religion of our nation, the Pope is not going to ask for any of the land that was taken back from the revolution. Because of that, the people who bought a lot of the church's land during that time period became these huge supporters of Napoleon. And you can kind of understand why, because they bought this land and he's not just going to take it away and give it back to the church. So they because of that, turned around and supported him in like droves. They just were hugely supportive of Napoleon. So with this agreement between Napoleon and the Pope, the idea of the Catholic Church being an enemy of the French government was no longer. There was no fighting between religion and non-religion, essentially. Okay, so before the French Revolution takes place, France doesn't have a big set of laws. They put in place things like the Constitution and other things that were put in place like that, but they didn't have like a set place for all of the laws. I mean, they had like I said here, almost 300 different legal systems in place. It was kind of a hot mess, for lack of a better words. During the revolution, they tried to make a set of rules, but it wasn't really effective. So Napoleon comes up with this idea of the civil code. This is a list of laws that people have to abide by. They're also kind of talked about as the Napoleonic Code because they were created by Napoleon. So you'll hear it called the Civil Code. You'll also hear it called the Napoleonic Code. But we're going to talk about what are some of the things that were in that document. It does preserve a lot of the gains of the revolution. So this idea of equality of all citizens, the idea of you have the right to choose your own profession, religious toleration, with making the Catholic Church is no longer an enemy of France. So that is all part of this Napoleonic Code, getting rid of serfdom and feudalism. Property rights are also protected underneath the code. But they did outlaw unions. They outlawed strikes. They tried to preserve employers' rights. So bosses essentially rights. So they would not allow people to strike. They didn't allow people to join unions, as we're going to talk about in the next chapter. At the same time this is going on with the Napoleonic era, we're also starting to see the start of industrialization. And as you should have learned last year, with the rise of industrialization, you see the rise of unions and labor organizations organizing to, promote the benefits of their own rights as workers of factories. So that's kind of going on at the same time as this, but so that's why we talk a little bit about the unions and the strikes. But those are outlawed under the Napoleonic codes. How do women fare? So like on paper, they kind of look better than they did during the revolution, but not as much. During the most radical phase of the French Revolution, there were these new laws that were made for divorce, which made it easier for people to divorce, and allowed children to inherit property when their parents die, inherit them equally. So if you have a sibling set of a brother and a sister, in the French Revolution, they would get that land 50-50. Well, Napoleon's civil code is going to kind of undo those laws and undo a lot of the equality things that women, the little, I should say, equality things that women got in the revolution. So divorce is still allowed under the Napoleonic codes, but they make it more difficult for women. It's more difficult for a woman to divorce her husband. And part of that is because women are considered less equal. They're considered to be minors when you talk about them being in lawsuits, and them having their testimony is less reliable as those of men. But the key thing is that when a woman got married, all of her property automatically went to her husband. So if she had no property transfers to her husband. If she had thousands and thousands of acres, or whatever it may be, whether she was inherited that from her family, if that was able to do, or bought it on her own, as soon as she got married, it all got transferred over to her husband. So when you turn around and then get a divorce, she no longer owns that property. Her husband owns that property. So, and she can't get it back if she divorces. So that's what I say when they allow divorces, but it's more difficult for women because of some of the limitations that they put on them when they do actually get married. All right, so a new bureaucracy. This is a new way for government to work. So during Napoleon's reign, people started to be promoted based on ability, not rank or birthright. So if you think back to, a monarchy, how do you become a monarch? You are born into it, right? We hear a lot of things of, in Great Britain today, Queen Elizabeth is pretty old. I think she's in her 80s or so. She's very old. Prince Charles would take over after her, and then it's Prince William. And Prince William married Kate, and they now have 3 kids. They just recently had a 3rd boy. And there's just a lot of talk about who, that succession of who takes over and is going to be the next king or of England. Well, in Napoleon's era, it's not based on your rank. It's not based on what family you're born into. It's based on ability. Do you have the ability to do that job? If you have the ability to do that job, then you are able to do that job. It has nothing to do with your name or your rank or anything like that. And it's for us, I think sometimes it's hard for us to understand the idea of just getting something because of your name. I mean, as far as government positions, it might still happen, but at least there's a process that people have to go through. You have to have the credentialing and the ability to do something, right? And this is something that obviously the middle class wanted at this point in time, because they don't want people just promoted because they're in that family and they have the same way of thinking. They want it to be, based on your ability. So Napoleon is also going to create a new social class, which we would call the noble class. So the ultimate question becomes, when we think about the French Revolution, is Napoleon a preserver of the revolution, or does he destroy the revolution? So when we look at the domestic policies, things that he did at home, you would say that he preserved the revolution because, you have your civil code, it preserves equality, even though women aren't treated as well, but it still has that whole sense of equality. But he also was going to destroy some of them, right? So liberty is no longer really a thing. He's going to shut down newspapers, and they're going to have to publish specifically what he wants them to publish. So he manipulates those newspapers a little bit more. I mean, even to the point where when you talk about mail, the mail is opened up by the government police. So you have this idea of civil code and people have these rights and liberties, but at the same time, on the other end, they don't have as much because of some of the other things that Napoleon is doing. So that's the kind of the ultimate question is, when you look at Napoleon, does he preserve the aims of the French Revolution, or does he destroy them? And we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit later on too, to kind of lay out and figure out for ourselves, what do you think? Do you think he's a preserver? Do you think he's a destroyer? Based on what we'll know about Napoleon. Okay, so we're going to shift gears here for a second, and we're going to talk about how he built his empire when it comes to the military, because he is very much known for his military conquests. He is super strong. He has a very strong military. He's also very smart when it comes to how to invade countries, when to retreat. And he's a fascinating person to study from his military tactics. Okay. So when he takes over, France is at war. France is at war with Austria, Prussia, and Britain. And so what's he going to do is he signs peace treaties with all of those countries by the next year. Okay. But quickly he becomes at war again with Great Britain, and then they're going to be later joined by Austria, Russia, Sweden, Prussia. They're going to kind of join back in. So he signs these peace treaties, and then we're going to start to get a little bit more into a war. So 1805 to 1807, Napoleon, so they called it the Grand Army because it was like huge. They were the first country to have a draft. They were the first country to ever institute a draft. And that's part of why they had so many soldiers and were able to defeat so many countries, along with, stronger military tactics. But so in 2 years, he's going to defeat the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians. He is going to kind of take over a lot of Europe, and he's going to create this kind of new look for Europe. And in fact, he is called the Master of Europe because of his domination by his military. Okay, so there's 3 major parts to his domination. He has the French Empire, he has dependent states, and he has allied states. So the French Empire would obviously be France and a couple of the surrounding countries. But as dependent states, these are going to be those countries that are under the rule of his relatives. So those countries would include Spain, Holland, Italy, Swiss Republic, the Rhineland area of Germany. And then those allied states are those states that he defeated. So earlier on, 1805 to 1807, those countries that he marched in and defeated, the Prussia, Austria, Russia. Okay. So he has like 3 different pieces to this. So because there was so much domination of France at this point in time, there's a way, he's able to spread some of those ideas of the revolution, okay, including being equal, including religious toleration, including this idea of economic freedom. But Napoleon does try to destroy the old order that were in those dependent states. So spreading the French Revolution principles is an important factor in the development of those countries. And the idea that Napoleon took them over, took the ideas of the French Revolution, spread those ideas into those countries is what makes those countries what they are today. Those countries would not be what they are today with, I would argue, without the influence of Napoleon. Okay. So, and the influence of the French Revolution, essentially. So, okay. So we're going to kind of stop here. And this is where Napoleon is at the peak, the grand part of his, whole rule, essentially. And what we're going to look at the next time we talk are, how does he fall? Like what ultimately destroys him? What takes him out of power? And it's fascinating for me to look at because we are going to be able to compare him. And then later on, when we talk in World War II, we're going to compare him to Adolf Hitler. Napoleon does not do anything like a Holocaust, but the downfall of Napoleon is almost exactly the same as the downfall of Hitler. So it just kind of goes to show you how, A, history can repeat itself, and B, how if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So, you just, if you don't pay attention to what's going on, you don't learn from what has happened in the past, whether it be like on a global scale or your own personal scale, you're probably going to fall down that same path again. So we'll get there when we get to World War II, but Hitler does kind of the same things that Napoleon does. So when I see you guys again, we're going to talk about ultimately why Napoleon falls. So until then, have a good morning or afternoon or evening, depending upon when you're watching this.